Welcome everybody. I believe we are live. I welcome all participants. I can't see exactly how many we are, but maybe people are coming in now. And a special welcome, of course, to our speakers. I will introduce the webinar. Welcome to this Earth Charter International webinar. Good morning in Costa Rica and good evening in other places. I hope you're all fresh here in the Netherlands where I am. It's very hot, so I hope I can keep my head cool. Special welcome to our two speakers of today, Bjorn Heyerdahl and Janika Heyerdahl. You are related. We will hear about your story. And we're really pleased to have you here with us. I'm Ali de Roering. I'm your moderator for today. I'm a member of the Earth Charter International Council, and in the Netherlands, I'm happy to coordinate the network of Earth Charter Friends. In my daily life and my direct living space, I am a small family farmer with a small food forest. Let's discuss and share experiences on the topic of integral design and generative projects through the lens of the Earth Charter. With this webinar, we intend to share with you all of the unique perspective of regeneration through integral design as an example of Earth Charter in action. And Bjorn and Janika embody these examples. We will hear their stories. So in the first part of this webinar, it will be two of them speaking. And in the second half of the webinar, we hope to have interaction with all of you. So welcome, dear participants. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers, guest speakers, and then I will ask them to introduce each other in a special way. Bjorn, I think your name is well known. You are the CEO of Integral Climate Change Solutions, founder of Midgard Expeditions. You're an active explorer in the footsteps, I think, of your ancestors, environmentalist, biospheric designer, you will explain to us what it means, and a consultant as well on humanitarian issues and development issues. Well, I think you will guide us in this experience. And then Janika, of course, we can identify you as Bjorn's daughter, but you yourself, you are a biological science educator on biochemistry and biological science at the University of Cape Town. You are involved in school projects and education for sustainable development. And in South Africa, I need to say that also Bjorn is active in South Africa and Lesotho and other countries. We would expect you to be in the northern of Europe, but you can explain how that went. Also, Janika, you, I think a few years ago, you participated in the program on education for sustainable development with the Earth Charter Education Center. And it would be nice to hear what that brought to you in your work. But let me first ask Janika, how would you introduce Bjorn?
Sure, big task. So I suppose, I hopefully am introducing him as a daughter, and I suppose how I see him in his professional life, but a gentle giant, I think, is the best way to introduce him. I think he can come across quite threatening and strong looking in a first appearance, but really, I think compassionate to the core is the best way to describe my dad. And he's ambitious, and he doesn't settle for anything less than the ideal. And I think that his life has been a testament to that. Hasn't made things easy. But definitely, I think that's something that he can be proud of. So I think those are just a few. I don't want to spend too much time, but I think those are a few things that would introduce him well. He's an explorer. He's compassionate. He's got heart. He's not willing to compromise on things that truly do matter. And so I think he pushes the people around him, and he's pushed us as our children, but to be more compassionate, which I think is through our lives and in our professional lives. So I think that's the best way to be pushed.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, it makes us all the more curious for Bjorn's story. And then Bjorn, to you the question. Of course, first, how would you like to introduce Janika? And maybe you can say something about your forefathers and mothers, and in the way you are maybe brought up in a certain tradition or knowledge that is interesting to hear, because we all remember your name, especially in Europe, I think, but I think all over the world. So please, how would you start introducing Janika and then your heritage?
Well, I think I would introduce Janika as the apple of her dad's eye, and as the highest expression of hyoidal genetics so far, everything that the Viking line might have hoped to bring into the world. The strength of the feminine aspect combined with resilience, sharp intelligence, real compassion, a true caring, a caring for her subject and for all those that she can influence. An incredible student and researcher, far more detailed than I am in many respects, and just the most wonderful daughter any father could hope to see blossom in the world. I'd love to take some credit for that, but I'm afraid she needs to take the bulk of the credit. She's earned her place in the world, and made her father and all those around her incredibly proud.
Thank you. That's great. And about you like to be a good ancestor yourself, but how do you look back to the past of your
Yes,
ancestors?
what Janika mentioned earlier, and Miriam's mentioned it to me over the years, is this strange Viking heritage, and the fact that I built Viking ships and I'm seen with axes and horns on my head and things like that. That it seems a bit of a contradiction to be a friendly or compassionate Viking. But the genetics one cannot help. And Bible mythology and the Norse mythology teaches us enormous lessons about sustainability, them living in such a harsh environment, them being primarily farmers, and their conquests as they are seen, and their exploration and trade was dominantly driven by a need for farm and for good fertile soils. So there's a kinship with the whole of my work, going back to that. Most people do know my grandfather as a very famous, one of the most famous Norwegians and archaeologists, a polymath studying multiple subjects, a controversial man in his own right, one of the most successful authors in all history, is Thor Heyerdahl of the Kon-Tiki expedition, and then the Ra, and then the Tigris, and so on. A real student and a real global citizen. And I think this is one space. The Vikings were known for global citizenship. They traveled, they assimilated themselves into other communities, learned the languages, and I think we have this with us. My grandfather was certainly able to do that, co-authoring the Green Cross International, and being a part of it from the beginning with Mikhail Gorbachev when he transitioned from a political life to a more philanthropic, and as we knew him as a prophet of change. My grandfather was very influential and very good friends, and held that relationship very dear, and respected Mikhail Gorbachev for the same reason I do, that he was able to navigate such a harsh political landscape, make those transitions, but not be calloused or be a political animal in itself. The fact that he could look towards the earth and see himself not as a Russian or as a president, but as a true citizen of the planet. And I think that's the gift that we have. It's what I try and describe in my book. It's what we try and do with our work. It's why we were attracted to participate in the Earth Charter. It is in the name of global citizenship, in not forgetting your identity, not trying to become something that you're not, but at the same time, seeing yourself on another level than just a local citizen with a localized or patriotic identity. And that's what I would like to explore in more detail later in this conversation, is what that actually means. And I've hoped to live that for my children. I've hoped to look after their interests as a father in terms of creating a greater perspective, a greater landscape, in pushing everyone to view themselves as not just a family unit, and to realize there's sacrifices to be made to extend our compassion to entire communities that we may never ever meet. But unless we do that and we see ourselves as the human family, then we're not fulfilling, in my opinion, all of the potential that we have as modern humans.
Thank you very much. That's good to hear. I would like to ask the participants, we cannot see you now, I cannot see you at least, but it's also good that you pose questions when you have them, also along when Bjorn and Janika are speaking, so that we can see where your interest is, and your questions are in the chat box. I think you can all access the chat box, I understand. So please do that. First, Bjorn will share his story, and we are all curious what you exactly mean with integral design and generative projects, that you share your examples of such generative projects, and maybe you can even share some images if we manage to do that in this Zoom technical environment. Also, I'm very curious how and where, when you came across the Earth Charter, how you are inspired by the Earth Charter, and what the Earth Charter, how it is integrated in your work. And then I think at the end of the session, we can speak a bit more about your book. But for now, maybe concentrate on your work. And when your story, we have listened to your story, we will go to Janika. So Bjorn, please go ahead.
Okay, mine is quite a long story, so I'm going to try and give you bite-sized chunks out of it. Unfortunately, the subject, or there's nothing fortunate or unfortunate about us, but the generation is not an uncomplicated one. In very simplistic terms, it means going further than conservation. So it means taking depleted soils, a depleted environment, an ocean, a riverine system, a forest, a farm, a village, and literally revitalizing it, bringing more fertility, more abundant life, bringing all the complex relationships that are required for biospheric life on this biosphere. We live in a sealed system that has specific proportions of oxygen and carbon and water. The microbiology is integral to making all of that actually function and produce us as higher life forms and feed us, although we don't always behave as higher life forms, of course. And this regenerative aspect stretches much further than simply regenerating soils, than making things more fertile or adding biodiversity. It definitely involves the regeneration of the human being and the whole being, because we are the single biggest impact, observable impact on the face of the earth at the moment, and on the atmosphere, and on the weather, and on the oceans, and so on and so on. Unless we condition the minds and hearts, our own first, and then that we reach out to those around us And I think that's a critical point. Just like when you're in an airplane and they're telling you to fasten your seatbelts, they tell you to pull the oxygen down, put your own mask on first, and then assist the person next to you. There's a little bit too much running to help everybody else before you've really addressed your own issues, your own faculties, in understanding and what it is that's required to regenerate. So in modern terms, it means regenerating our economy, finding an economy and technologies, be they agricultural or production-wise, that actually add life. They don't degrade the environment they're part of. They don't produce waste. You hear till you're blue in the face, waste recycling, picking up litter on the beach, but very few people talking about not having litter on the beach in the first place, not producing those chemicals, not using those materials, because as quick as you pick them up, they're going to reappear. And we have this particulates of plastic in the highest regions of the planet, in the glaciers, right in the deepest parts of the oceans. We've impregnated this whole planet with elements that are ill-designed. So to move from your question of what regeneration is to what integral design is a thinking approach and a practical design approach, which involves architecture, involves bulk services provision like energy and water, food provision, the management of the entire supply chain for human food and food production, the protection of the integrity of the genetics of the planet and those relationships that have evolved over so much time, and how these are best expressed, other than in academic speak or in laboratories, is in people's own backyards and on agricultural holdings. And it doesn't matter the scale. We've now demonstrated globally that this can be done over hundreds and thousands of hectares. Whole coastlines can be regenerated. We can replant mangroves like the Thor Heyerdahl Climate Park in Myanmar along the coast, where 10 million mangroves have been planted up riverine estuaries and along the coast. Major scale regenerative programs like that. But often people feel a little intimidated by that. And that's why we do the work, the kind of work that I do with my daughter Janika and others on school projects, where it's small scale gardening that's integrated into the bread basket and the education. And I'll let her speak to that because it's more her subject than mine.
Yes, Bjorn.
But I still have an active hand in those projects, just busy with one here in the Eastern Cape.
I think it would be really interesting for us to hear how you concretely do this. You mentioned the mangrove farm, more or less, in the coastline. If you say regenerative actions, then, and you mentioned, for instance, the picking plastic, but how then do you focus on taking the causes away instead of reacting to this? Can you give us a few examples?
Yes, it does involve both. And I can give you an example on our climate park in the Eastern Free State in South Africa, on the border of the Lesotho, the Kingdom of Lesotho. We have a demonstration model there of a 121 hectare farm, where using cattle, we have regenerated and demonstrated how to use agriculture at quite a large scale to regenerate a landscape, to turn pristine grasslands back to the diverse grasslands they were. And obviously there's also a rehabilitation of soils. There's a removal of the plastics. We have picking up programs of beach cleanups, all of those. So I'm not saying that that's not part of the solution. But what we're more focused on, as you've highlighted correctly, is the causal elements, the lack of thinking about what it is that I do here upstream and how that may affect people and myself downstream. So we get involved with zero waste policy production for corporates so that they can look at alternatives to petrochemical projects, plastic and the like, and look at glass as an option, or even better still, just having people reuse containers of different kinds and produce your own food. So in practice, we would look at the architecture. So it would be alternative building methods, the lack of need for building in the first place. It would be energy supply, using renewable energy supply, but reducing again the need for the energy in the first place as a priority over producing new technologies. So our focus is not on exciting new technologies, more toys, more things that need to be produced, but on design systems that reduce the requirement for those things in the first place. We've got trillions of dollars in the US going into the development of new technologies. The last thing we need is new technologies. We've been through this obsessive phase where all solutions are technological in nature, whereas in actual fact, they need to be designed out of the system. And that's why affecting the psyche and making people not wanting to collect more interesting toys and have bragging rights about the electrical cars that now produce 50 tons of waste in production and replace their old car. That they start looking at alternatives in lifestyle, the way they interact, the way their economies go. So it's about, to quote the Earth Charter again, about finding yourself through being more rather than having more. To place a value on information, on art, on aesthetics, on nature, on experiences, on things that don't require production. We don't need toys when we grow up as human beings.
I understand. And if you say,
but I could go on for a very long time, so I'm going to pause there.
Sorry? You mentioned the farm as an example.
Yes. So the integral approach on the, do you want to know more about the farm?
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you measure that your success in terms of regeneration? How do you find out that you are on the right track? And another question is, what happens to the surrounding people in the community? Do they see your example as a good example to follow? Or what are the reactions in the community to your work?
To answer the first part of your question, how we assess our methodology. So we have very specific ways of mimicking the way wild animals move and integrating wild animal movement to our farm. So we encourage the wild animals to be there, both the predators and the ruminants and so on, and they form part of the ecology. We move the cattle around and the chickens and other animals in a very specific way. We interplant species, and on that particular farm, we've been there for just over 5 years. We take aerial photographs that show a dramatic enhancement in the density, the quality of soil, the rehabilitation of erosion as compared to our neighbors. We see that we have additional water flow. We can measure how much water we're percolating into the soils, how much water is being held in those soils, at what surface. We can measure the root depth of the plants. We can see that from 2 grasses, we're now at between 14 and 16 grasses in terms of biodiversity on the mountain plains. So there's an incredible amount of data that can be measured to show the health of an environment, or the fact that it is regenerating. And there's indicator species like certain frogs that are very sensitive, and we have now abundance of those. So we know that the environment is host to very sensitive creatures that are these indicator species. It would take a while to describe all of those things, but that's some of them. And the production value of food, so how much food can now be produced per square meter of soil that's under agriculture. In terms of your question about the engagement of communities around us, we have some large-scale farmers, commercial dairy farmers. We have indigent communities. We have a township of not very wealthy people that live 7 kilometers away from us, where the school of Mawutse is. And those of you who looked at the videos in preparation for this would have seen that myself and Janika and the crew from the Vipoort farm, Thomas and Michelle and Mafusi, who's on the Earth Charter program, just finished up with Miriam now from Lesotho, are actively involved in engaging those communities. So we plant there, we run training programs, we offer hospitality, we invite people to come and see how we manage the cattle, how we manage the soils, how we grow the plants. We make donations, we engage academia. So we have a formal relationship with the Northwest University and their business school to help create entrepreneurs, environmental entrepreneurs of the small scale farmers that are adjacent to us. So we have a very sophisticated approach, all based on the ethics of the Earth Charter. So we use the Earth Charter as our primary document and compass. It's the checklist to make sure we're dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's across the spectrum, because it's so well thought out in how broad it is. From a biochemistry point of view, from a psychological point of view, obviously there's a lot more that gets added to that work. But as our structural document, that's our go-to or our constitution. And that links us to the communities around us. We found no matter what ethnic group or tribal orientation or language or culture, everybody seems to resonate with the Earth Charter. I'm trying to have it translated by a friend of mine into Zulu for the first time. And we've been talking to Mafusi about having it translated into Sotho.
Thank you.
So we'll keep up on that progress, yes.
And also that will help Janika a lot in the educational work, perhaps, when it's in the language people live and speak to. Bjorn,
Absolutely.
for now, thank you. I've seen a very interesting question from Anupan for you on design, but let's get back to that later when we have the interactive session. It would be nice now to listen to Janika for a while. And Janika, if that's all right, then because I learned that you also work exactly on the same issues, but then you make connections between education, food security, sustainability, and design. That makes me really curious what this means in how can you illustrate how you do that, what you do, with whom, what is the setting, what can we learn from you? Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I started my academic career in biochemistry and biological sciences, which I think was, I think biochemistry, if it's not awe-inspiring, then I don't know, because it really is just the intricacies and the seems like biological machinery that is so microscopic that goes on to have every functioning in our body really was completely mind-blowing for me. So that was really something that started getting me quite awe-inspired by biological systems and how they worked and how they interacted and what complexity there was to them that was sort of self-maintained. So I really enjoyed that in my biochemistry, and it gave me that sort of reverence for what was going on within our biological systems. I did enjoy more sort of ecology and the macro ecology and biological systems. So I took that a little bit further and did some research with a sort of conservation approach, actually looking at some grazing regimes and carbon sequestration, which is similar to what my dad's working with now. But so that was sort of my academic background, but it was still quite sterile for me. And I actually struggled with academia. I think I sort of hungered for interaction with people, and I didn't quite see where the effect of my work would come in. It wasn't quite direct. I think a lot of it sort of I would see it could be a published journal article, but where that's sort of informing of policy or the actual impact of the work you were doing, I think maybe I was a bit impatient, but I didn't quite feel that sort of motivation in terms of what was being, where my energy was going. And so I actually took on an internship at a school. I started working full time, but I still had this passion for sustainability, and still had my dad sort of pushing me, and in terms of whenever we would talk about my work or what I was doing, in terms of what I could be doing, what could be more holistic. And I think for any child, it can drive you nuts sometimes, but like I say, it was pushing me in a direction that was more compassionate, was more inclusive, and I knew it. So I would feel frustrated with the sort of basic system that I was working with, or the basic curriculum. And then I was introduced to the Earth Charter by my dad, and he pushed me actually to do the course. I was a little bit tired of studying, so it was a little bit of a push, but I'm very grateful for it. So the Earth Charter basically just opened up a whole nother world for me. To say it was transformative, it's transformative to say the least, the experience. I think it opened up my eyes completely. And I mean, this is just showing you, I sort of did an undergraduate and an honors degree, and I didn't, in biological sciences, and I didn't quite understand what sustainability was. We work in these silos. So I was looking just at these, and we'd look at it would be highly specific what we're looking at. And the people that would be working in biological sciences, of course they care, and they are, I think in their own lives, probably driven to sustainable engagement. But that was not something that I got out of that qualification necessarily, because of sort of how siloed our structured education system is. So I think it opened up a whole nother world in terms of just production and waste production, and just looking at, I think I got to look more at sort of our production systems, and how those can be sort of tailored in a more, to mirror, I suppose, with a biomimicry sense, to sort of tailor our ecological system, mirror our ecological systems a little bit more closely. So anyway, I got a little bit more into understanding what sustainability was as a whole, and what actually it entailed. Because I obviously was aware of some aspects like water usage or energy usage, but there was so much more in terms of biodiversity, and there was a lot that I was opened up to. And then obviously what it brought in as well is a very emotive aspect. The Earth Charter, when you read it as a document, is very emotive. How it talks about responsibility, universal responsibility, about a community of life, about identity. Those are all very big, weighty, deep topics. And I think you can read over them, but I think the more, I was actually just reading over the Earth Charter again today in preparation, and I saw this element of identifying under universal responsibility in the preamble, identifying ourselves with the whole community of life. That is incredibly profound. And I think there are very few people who actually would identify themselves with their community of life. I think even we struggle with our own personal identity at points, just as within our sort of bag of skin in a sense. But that is quite a profound, moving statement. So I think the more I've read it, the more depth I found in it. But through the course, there was sort of a heart-centering practices. There were elements that became added a lot of depth to the sphere of sustainability, and I hadn't ever really made that connection between this sort of spiritual experience of awe, of joy, of peace, which obviously we seek in all kinds of horrendous ways as human beings, which we never find in those ways. And I do believe that the only way that we do find them is through time in nature, deeper connection with nature and with each other. And basically I had never really brought these two together, the spiritual understanding and this development of the heart and evolution of the heart and capacity for empathy and sustainability. So that was just a whole nother world open for me. And I started more technically using the Earth Charter. So I used it as a checklist when I was putting together my education programs. I put together a 2-week, we broke away from the curriculum, and I put together a 2-week program for they're 13 years old. It's grade 8 in South Africa. And we put together project-based learning activities where they didn't have to go to lesson. We collaborated as teachers and we put together this learning experience. And it was, as much as it was incredible for them, they were working outside and they had a little plot of land where they had to assess the biodiversity, they had to assess the water, the rainfall, the soil, what the soil contents was. We had all these technicalities. But the things that were profound and moving for me, and I could tell for the children as well, was the actual interactions that they had with very seemingly insignificant creatures outside. So for example, one of the child, they walked with their iPads, and one of the girls went and took a picture of her, she was taking a picture of an ant because they're now doing a biodiversity survey of their little plot. And she comes and shows me this picture and she zooms in and she says, look at this. This ant was looking straight at me when I took the second picture of it. It knew I was there. You know, she had this very profound, I mean, she's a 13-year-old girl. These days, they're far more excited with boys or iPads or technology or the latest trends of clothes. And, you know, it's not an easy age. And she was overjoyed at this interaction that she had with something that's seemingly insignificant. So these are the things that really held on strong for me. I obviously had other interactions and breakthroughs that the girls had in terms of understanding, you know, comparing the nature reserve next door to what this pristine lawn of the school looked like, and what change we had actually made to this environment, and the decline in biodiversity that the school itself had as a structure being there. So we had all of those, but I must say those little interactions were hugely profound. So that sort of led me slowly, and I think engaging with the Earth Charter more and more. And then I had to leave the school that I was working at. So I did two big projects there, which were hugely successful, and they're still running, which is fantastic. But then I had to move overseas with my now husband, and I started working on my master's. So then I got a little bit deeper into, I really wanted to understand, if I look at something like the Earth Charter, what causes a person to become this compassionate? What causes a person to care this much? Is it a potentiality that all human beings have? If so, how is that groomed? And my dad will talk a lot about sort of developmental psychology and that sort of thing. So he's introduced me to it, and I've become very interested. But I got really interested in the technicality. So in my dissertation, I started looking at moral competence, so a moral development. I started looking at spiritual intelligence and environmental identities, the extent to which an individual includes their personal identity, well, the environment and their personal identity, and seeing how that sort of correlated. It's just a correlational study with pro-environmental behaviors. So some very basic pro-environmental behaviors of recycling, waste reduction, energy use reduction, and then some more high-level activism. Mm-hmm. And I had quite profound results with those, really significant impacts. So that really, very long way around, but that's really this deep and deeper tunnel that the Earth Charter truly has taken me down. And every time I read it now with new eyes, I see it at greater depth. But I really feel that we have these capacities for empathy, that these very high levels of empathy as human beings, which are so foundational to everything that we see produced here. So that has been a real big focus in terms of me trying to study and look at bringing into educational programs for sustainability, which I don't think is being done, deliberate development of empathy. So through particular storytelling, and then with one thing that I've done with Mafusi recently is looking at a story. And then the individual needs to either verbally or through writing extrapolate this character. So from what you know, write some more about the character. Write how they might have felt in this scenario or that scenario. Write a letter from one character to another, or write a letter to that character about how you felt about what they experienced. So this very deliberate empathy development that starts also maybe with that individual himself and what they've experienced. As a little girl that we worked with in the community, and reading the story really prompted an experience that she had at school, and that she felt quite shameful about, with calling someone out for cheating in a test or something. And we were able to work through that, and then she could only then start looking at and actually engaging with the material, because it was so sensitive, before she was able to digest that, could she then start having empathy for these, because it also becomes a block. So anyway, these different levels of deepening in their capacity for empathy, and then identifying with broader and broader spheres of life. So those are the kind of pedagogies that I've been researching more and trying to implement into these educational programs.
Thank you, Janika. I think this sounds that you make a much deeper connection with the youngsters you relate to in the education sphere, that it's a deeper relationship than you had before. Absolutely. Maybe let me read to you. There is a comment from Victor, who joins this webinar. Sorry for the sounds here in my background. There are children playing. I can't help it. Victor is in this webinar through YouTube, and Amanda picked up his comment. He says, how do I easily integrate eco-literacy as an environmental education to young teenagers and youth? Though currently I have been trying to get into more storytelling approach. I think it relates to what you just said. Though it's working, but it's there. Let me see. He asked whether it works for you. And then a lot of young people don't really understand what this entails. And I think he also underwent the education course, and that it really changed. It's been a great move for me, and I'm forever grateful for such a great opportunity the Earth Charter has given me. Thank you, Victor. Janika, how can you react to Victor on that question?
So in terms of eco-literacy with children, I think, so storytelling is really useful in terms of, I think, I always think of introducing it into trying to integrate these things into the structure that already exists within the school, because they do have these very practical things they need to adhere to. So in terms of the storytelling, I found that more useful sort of to bring into English or life orientation, one of those subjects that they have where they have to do creative writing, and bringing that in as a creative writing, and more as an element in their actual empathy development, and their ability to take the perspective of another, or write about multiple perspectives, which is super important, because I think something that the Earth Charter brings to the fore is the subjectivity of life. So seeing something seemingly as inanimate as a tree or a mushroom or whatever it may be as a subject rather than an object. So starting to take the perspective and role of other human beings is really important in terms of our empathy and our capacities for empathy. And then later on to other living organisms, non-human beings. But in terms of eco-literacy, if I understand what he's meaning, and it's basically understanding basic ecological principles. Is that what I think that's what he's trying to teach or get through? But I think that the best thing is to bring something in that captures their awe and is tactile for them. So something that we did in Mautse, which really worked well, was we started with a worm farm. So we literally just had a tub of manure, and we had a tub of rotten food, and we had a bucket of worms, of earthworms. And they are hugely important in terms of any sort of regenerative practice. And they're a nice macro decomposer, a macro organism, that can be seen and felt, and it wiggles, and they all grossed out, and they laugh at each other if they grossed out. But something that's very interactive and that grabs them, that will be memorable, and that they can actually see the change. So I think that something like that, that's that's shocking, that's ew, that's a bit, that's they can laugh about, that they can get some joy out of, is really important, and that they can actually get their hands dirty. So all of them held a worm, and they're keen to hold a worm. They all had to have their own one. Some of them were freaked out, and that was hysterical for the others, that they were scared of the worm. But to then be able to see and watch, very simply, to feel the manure, feel the soil, watch the worms dig down into the soil, put the food waste there, and see that this food that would have get chucked away is now going to become this beautiful, rich soil that then is going to make us nice, nutrient-dense food. So they're able to actually see, and I mean, it's a slow process, it's not linear, and there are lots of challenges that we're facing. But I think that experience was hugely profound, and a lot of the teachers were very excited themselves about the experience. So yeah, I think experiences like that, and it's such a simple one, but it's so foundational to everything we want to teach with regeneration. We want to teach about nutrient density. We want to teach about waste, and what waste actually is, and how it can be used, and how valuable it can be. And yeah, to basically just have awe about watching things grow as well. Now that they plant seedlings in that soil and see how beautifully they grow, and compare that with the very hard, sandy soil that they've got usually, that's quite a profound experience. So I think something tactile, something to see, something that might be a bit gross, that's shocking, is very, very useful.
Thank you. That's great to hear. Thank you. I think now we've heard both of you speaking, and it's very enthusiastic, and I can imagine that in your environment it's easy to learn. I've seen you in action in one of the videos. Maybe it's possible for Amanda or Miriam to share a few links in the chat box for people to see how you do this with people and in your environment. It may be nice to go back to Bjorn again for a while. And Anupam, maybe you can unmute yourself. You had a few interesting questions on design. I think they were more meant for Bjorn. Can you repeat your question, the one you wrote in? I saw you had some interaction already with Bjorn, but it's interesting for the others as well. What did you have in mind to ask Bjorn?
Well, firstly, thank you, both of you, for this very fascinating exposure to your work. Thrilled to learn about it. Thank you so much. I really got intrigued by your use of the phrase integrated design or integral design. And to my mind, when you talk of something integral, it means that basically the parts form the whole. And so therefore, when you think about the parts forming the whole, the challenge really is to know what are the parts which are part of the whole and which are not part of the whole. So somewhere we tend to draw a boundary. And what is the wisdom that you use in order to create that boundary? Because I think critical to ensuring that we don't get unintended effects is the recognition of this boundary and the recognition of the fact that it is an integral whole that we deal with or we are designing. So that's my first question. And, what would be the principles or wisdom that you would list out perhaps for doing integral design as against engineering design? Because in some sense, I think in our educational system, which is so fragmented, which talks about physics and chemistry and biology and humanities, and we somehow have no integral education. We don't have an integral design of education. So how can we have integral design if we don't have integral but fragmented education?
So that's also a question for Janika, but first Bjorn, please comment.
Okay. I think rather than the term as opposed to engineering design or architectural design or functional systems design, the integral design approach transcends and includes those principles. So there are valuable principles with efficiencies, with material considerations, with economic considerations, with a focus on functionality and particularly efficiency, with engineering. When you transcend them, though, you throw your net of thinking wider, as you point out, to include 4 major quadrants or perspectives. There's actually 8, but we'll simplify it to 4 for today. One being the I quadrant, which would be the phenomenology, the psychology, the internal picture, the belief systems, the values of the individual. And that has to be considered in any design system. But that individual, if we extend, as my daughter was saying, our compassion and our identity to include in our identity all sentient life, then we also include the phenomenology and the perspective of the plant as a sensory being, of the microbe, of the mammal, and so we go on. So we include as not just a functional aspect in the design, but actually having an interest, a perspective, experiencing pain, taking in sensory input and involving feedback to us in the system. And that is one quadrant, to become more sensitive about the phenomenology and use it on our design template. The second one would be the collective thereof. So it would also be the internal perspectives, but of groups. So when you talked about setting up a boundary, we may be boundary-wise, for example, dealing with a Zulu rural community on the north coast of Natal, north of Durban. Or we could be dealing with an Indian community, or we could be dealing with an urban community in the middle of New York, or a youth segment of the community. So we would have a boundary so that we could specialize our focus, but we would not allow that boundary to not get us to extend perspectives and look at impacts outward from it. So we have the grander scheme of things, which is always the biosphere. So the first question is, does this thing that we're going to create enhance or detract from all the other systems in the biosphere? All of them. The water, and we can have them as a checklist, the water systems and so on and so on. But the phenomenology is also expressed in the we quadrant. So we have the I quadrant, which is the individual perspective. We have the we quadrant, which is the cultural context or perspective. We then have the it quadrant, which is the behavioral, the atomic, the parts per million, the measurable, the weight, the external manifestation, the nature and movement and behavior of things that are observable externalities. And that would involve the material selection and so on and so on, mining and things like that. But it's the particulates. The fourth major perspective is the systems perspective. So it's the exterior group, which would be termed an autopoietic look, a systems approach, where we look at whole economic systems, whole political systems. And we know that there are political systems within political systems, and there are social systems within social systems. So again, it's very hard to answer your question on how do we set up boundaries. The fact is, with true integral design, we don't, other than for analysis. So we always see the human or the plant or the portion of water or the soil that we're dealing with or the animal in the grander context in the whole system. And that it is part of the ecological system, the biospheric system, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the pedosphere. All of these major spheres are on our template. And we can't necessarily burden this discussion, although I'm sure me and you could have a lively discussion specifically on this subject. And if you read, there's a chapter in my book which covers precisely this element, and the 2 videos that were referred to touch on it. But again, if we just took those 4 quadrants as the internal individual, the external group or culture, the parts per million type analysis, the structural, the material or behavioral, observable, and then the systems. if you look at everything that you do and you look at its impact on those 4 spheres and what it will look like from those 4 spheres, you get to say that you had an integral or integrated approach. The fact is, nothing ever does anything but tetra arise through those 4 spheres. We only separate them out. We have a psychologist who studies psychology, but he has to bridge it to behavioral psychology and look at the exterior sometimes. He has to understand that nutrition impacts. He has to understand that the social system impacts. So he goes down to the systems quadrant. Everybody, although they try to specialize, if they're going to do a real job for a real human or a real animal or a real piece of land, they're going to be pushed towards thinking integrally.
Thank you, Bjorn. Anupam, I see you nodding. I think it resonates with you. I don't know whether you have a new comment, but Janika, can you respond maybe to this question on we hardly have education that is integrated, is holistic, or do you think it's coming up now more? And maybe can you see that other educators around you see that your approach is working? That's infectious, perhaps?
So I must say, being a physical agent and being in the school, definitely I could see it, and I could see it moving quickly. But I do think it is still rare, the way of thinking. I don't think it seems radical in the school environments that I've been in to do it that way, truly. And it does require a lot of conversation, a lot of consistent re-engaging, because when people are engaged in it, they get very excited, and they want to be involved in it. But it's like you say, it hasn't been instilled in our education systems, not in our higher education systems, and so people don't necessarily have the capacity to think in this way just yet. So I do believe it's very much possible. I obviously believe that it's very much necessary, but it's a mammoth task to start having, because it's big changes and big shifts that need to happen, because it's a system change, and because you're trying to take an integral approach, it needs to be changes that permeate the entire system at all levels, in all existing silos. There are a lot of boundaries that need to be broken. So sort of my ideal vision would be to have school environments where children move through and the entire environment is saturated with the principles that we are talking about today, so that it can't not be caught. So by the way that they manage their waste, by the way that they get their water and clean it, by the way that they get energy and use energy, the food that's on campus, the way people talk to each other and behave with each other, it sort of needs to be. Children truly do. It's quite a cliche, but they watch what we do. They don't listen to what we say. And so I think it really is. It's sort of a chicken and egg story, but I think it does need to. It's a shift in leadership that needs to take place, because you have to have individuals that are constantly moving through that space, thinking in this way and prioritizing the things that we're talking about and being very passionate about them and pushing them, because people very easily stagnate and get comfortable. So I think you do need passionate drivers, and I think people are keen to get on board. But that's why I think this Earth Charter educator course is so powerful, is because the more people that you can have as change agents, because you cannot not be passionate and almost dedicate your life to having people hear about this and feel moved by this after you've been through that experience. So having more change agents that are able to really affect change within their environments and drive it. I think from my experience, people are keen, but you do need to be there constantly driving and guiding and translating what you've learned and experienced and the transformation you've gone through.
Yes. And Janika, I'm sure you've heard then that the Earth Charter International Secretariat is also working on an Earth Charter, you could say trademark or
Yes.
For schools. Do you think that could help if schools could carry the Earth Charter as a trademark, as a certificate? And
Absolutely.
then, yes, that could help, you think, in the context also of South Africa?
I definitely think so. You know, I think it's quite so we have quite a strange setup in South Africa. I don't know how different it is in other parts of the world, but we've got very wealthy, privileged schools, sort of private schools and privately funded schools with governing bodies. And then we've got our public schools. We have Model C schools, which are partially privately funded, partially by government. And then we have fully government funded schools. And obviously, depending on what the school is and the level of funding, you get different levels of education a lot of the time, and a lot of the schools are very under-resourced. But in terms of the private sphere, there's a lot of competition between the schools, and I think having something that they are able to market and give themselves an edge, even if that's just the initial intention, I think is quite powerful. And I think, it's obviously not something that we want to be the priority, but I do think that will, if you can say you can have this accredit, and it could go towards some sort of social, environmental qualification of something that you're now doing. I think it could be very, very useful, and just to have a structured checklist of how to introduce the Earth Charter into the school system, and have a mentor. I'm not sure how it's going to work, but have a mentor guide that facilitates that process. I think it'll be incredibly powerful.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to Bjorn again. Maybe you can make yourself visible, if that's possible. I did see you shared already in the chat box something on the Midgard expedition. Maybe you can say a bit more about that, and later I will conclude with saying something about your book, which is about the expedition experience as well. Bjorn, I know that you have engaged not only in the farms experience, but also in this expedition, which is very exciting. You took people on board in a boat that they helped build, I believe, and then what you do on the farm, you also do there with the team. Can you say a bit more about that story?
For a moment, my signal's a little bit up and down. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Just to kick off, the Midgard Expedition has been a series of expeditions since the 1990s to explore models of sustainability, and whether they're tribal or modern or ecosystems, to take groups of explorers and scientists and students into environments where we can learn about the integral nature of the systems we are part of, and see functioning models of sustainability. The latest one, which is what you're referring to in the book, is the Viking Expedition, where I built a Viking longboat, a real Viking sailing ship here in Africa, and we sailed it around the Cape of Storms, which was a
Oops, I'm afraid the connection just disappeared a bit. Or is it just me who doesn't hear it? Okay, continue. Yes, now you're back. I hope it works.
Okay. Sorry, the signal dropped. I'm going to leave my video off for a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know how far I had got before I was cut off, but we built a Viking ship, sailed it around the Cape. We built it on completely sustainable principles, and you can have a look at it on the midgardexpedition.com. There's videos and documentaries and so on. But we sustainably harvested the timber. We made our own nails. we used every effort to make it exactly as the Vikings made their ships, and we sailed it under the Earth Charter flag to create a voice piece, a literal vessel to take this message. And where we stopped, we did beach cleanups, we did educational for students and adults. We talked to sailors and journalists, and we basically tried to get the message out using this Viking ship as a tool and as a vessel to take the message. And I've always just wanted to have a Viking ship that I have to add, so it wasn't a completely philanthropic exercise. Having it's a lifelong child dream to build such a boat and actually sail it, and it was just mind-blowing to stand on that deck and watch this huge Viking sail go out, and to feel the oars in your hand, and it's such a grounding experience, and to be on a fluid medium like the ocean with a vessel that performs so well, and it's just using the wind and manpower and woman power. We split the crew down the middle with men and women, and we had an extraordinary experience of how appropriate technologies like wind-driven boats can give us such pleasure and function so well.
That's great, and I understood that it's not so easy now to join another expedition with you because it's difficult times for us to travel. I do hope in the future you will do this again and we can all participate. Please invite us. But I was really interested when I read this book review of your book, The Midgard Expedition, by a Russian editor who says I read it through in one breath, and he also said, this book contains much more than the story of the construction of a Viking ship and sailing around Cape of Storms. Bjorn frankly shares various episodes from his life, explains in detail his view on current state of our civilization, which once preferred the anthropocentric development over natural evolution. In the wild, it's important that the author is not launching into lengthy discussions with the risk to end up a bit scholastic, but offers clear plans for overcoming the ecological crisis on a planetary scale. So, it's about leadership, the psychology of leadership. I think we should all read your book. We can find it online, or maybe Amanda can share a link to the book. Then we also can see what the expedition entails. I would really like to thank both of you. It's really inspiring to know more about your work. We've not been together for a while in the physical meetings, but this is a good alternative to follow you and to know more. I would like to, before we close this webinar and thank all participants, to look a little bit ahead on. For this month, it is June, and end of June, the 29th, we celebrate 21 years Earth Charter after the launch of the Earth Charter in the year 2000 in the Peace Palace. And it's interesting that the theme that Earth Charter International has chosen for the celebration, and I hope you all celebrate at home, wherever you are with your community, toast to the Earth Charter, and the theme is intergenerational solidarity. And we will have a webinar on that day of the 29th of June. It will still be announced on the website. And it's with youth leaders, the elder youth leaders who started in the early years of the Earth Charter and the younger Earth Charter leaders. But I think you both are an example of this intergenerational cooperation and solidarity, Bjorn and Janika. It's really inspiring how you as family, but also in your own authentic capacities, do work for the common good and for Earth, for Earth who carries us. So you're an example of taking care of Earth who cares for us. Thank you all. This will be on YouTube to listen for all those who missed it. So it will go into the future. And so I would like to say thank you to all participants, and thank you to Bjorn, Janika, and also to the Earth Charter Secretariat to make this possible, Miriam, Amanda, and the others. Maybe you can all unmute and just say hello and goodbye and see you again.